Chris, you actually mentioned this phenomenon in a piece that you just wrote up at SheerPost. The piece is called Ukraine and the Politics of Permanent War. And you talk about, you say the militarists who have waged permanent war have invested heavily in controlling the public narrative. The enemy, whether Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin, is always the epitome of evil, the new Hitler. So I want to ask you more about that and your new piece on censorship. But before going there, what did you see at the same time? Where were you when the Soviet Union fell? And what are your thoughts on Gorbachev?
Well, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. So East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Romania. And of course, Gorbachev, I think for myself and all of us who were in Eastern Europe in 1989, was a heroic figure because you had the East Germans pleading with the Soviet government to send in the tanks, as they did in '68 in Prague or in Hungary. When was Hungary? '56 maybe, right, Bob? Yeah. And he wouldn't do it because he was a humane and decent human being. And he essentially made possible the recapturing of autonomy by Eastern European states that had been essentially run by quisling regimes that were subservient to Moscow. And that is the tragedy. He was betrayed. I mean, I think Putin said correctly about Gorbachev that he was naive. And I would argue that Putin in the early years was naive about the intentions of the West, and in particular, the United States. Because in order to perpetuate the permanent war economy, you have to have an enemy. And if somebody won't be an enemy, then they're going to be made the enemy. So Gorbachev and in the first years, Putin were all reaching out to have observer status with NATO or some kind of new security pact that would include the Russian Federation. But of course, the arms industry and the militarists were having none of it. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, I was in East Germany the night I was there when it was breached. NATO, of course, should have been rendered obsolete. NATO, created in 1949 to prevent Soviet expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, had no longer any raison d'etre. But the militarists were not only intent on keeping NATO, but then carrying out a process of provocations against Russia by expanding NATO throughout Eastern and Central Europe, violating a promise that had been made by Thatcher and Hans-Dietrich Genscher, the foreign minister of Germany, and the Reagan administration, not to, or I guess it was Baker, not to expand NATO beyond the borders of a unified Germany. There was no reason to expand it other than it was multi-billion-dollar arms market, because by expanding NATO and incorporating these countries into NATO, they have to have NATO-compatible military equipment. And that meant getting rid of the old Soviet bloc equipment and most of it was done through IMF loans, taking out huge loans to buy all of this hardware. Then there was the promise, well, okay, we'll expand, but we won't put U.S. troops. Clinton made that promise. He violated that. I think there's going to be 100,000 U.S. troops. And George Kennan, the great Soviet specialist who formulated the policy of containment, said that the expansion of NATO was the greatest strategic blunder in the post-Cold War era. And everybody, Burns, in this memo that was leaked, published by WikiLeaks, right, they all knew what Putin would do because Ukraine was not unreasonable. And you have to remember that Russia was invaded 3 times or 2 times in the 20th century, and then once in the 19th. Napoleon and the Kaiser took huge parts of Russia and Brest-Litovsk. Of course, they ceded almost all of the Ukraine and the Baltic states and everything else. And then, of course, in 1941 with the Nazis. And the Nazis devastated. I mean, this is all another one of the fallacies of the Cold War. Russia was destroyed, and Stalin had no interest after the end of World War II in another conflict. He was desperately trying to rebuild basically all of European Russia that was in ruins. So I wrote a column on Bob's site called Chronicle of a War Foretold. It was completely predictable. We knew. Now, I'm not excusing what Putin did in Ukraine, but historians, when they go back and look at World War I, will always talk about the Treaty of Versailles, the humiliation that was imposed on Germans after World War I, the onerous reparations that destroyed the economy and the credibility of Weimar as being a causal factor in creating the rise of fascism, as it was, along with, of course, the Depression, which trashed, and then the international banking system, which just sucked every ounce of marrow out of the Weimar Republic. They couldn't even pay unemployment insurance. They had 30% at least unemployment, maybe higher. So I mean, there are, and I look at the same with the war in Ukraine. It's not unreasonable, especially given the history, for Russia to ask that Ukraine remain a neutral country. And the U.S. just couldn't let it go. It was hubris. It was, especially at the beginning, this sense of omnipotence that the Soviet Union was broken and weak and, of course, didn't exist. They could do whatever they want. It was a unipolar world. And then, of course, there was money to be made on top of it. So the whole thing is tragic. This proxy war in Ukraine will destroy Ukraine. God knows how many Ukrainian families will spend the rest of their lives convulsed in grief, how much suffering we're visiting on Ukraine. It's a very cynical process, and Russia as well. I think we do have to condemn the invasion of Ukraine. It's preemptive war. It's wrong. On the other hand, we have to be very clear that Putin was baited. That is just incontrovertible. You can't argue against it. And not only baited, but the very architects, and read that memo from Burns, they all knew what Russia would do. And just to close, we have to remember that Ukraine, before the conflict, after the US-backed coup in 2014, became a de facto NATO country. You had US and European military advisors in there. You were sending in all sorts of NATO equipment, even though it wasn't technically part of NATO. And so, I think that was, we pushed Russia into a corner, and they reacted in the way that most experts on Russia and Eastern Europe knew they would react, and they got what they wanted. That's what they wanted. They want perpetual war. The American economy is built on perpetual war. We don't produce anything anymore but weapons, virtually, and the militarists have complete and total control. I mean, the two ruling parties, are completely subservient to the militarists. And Seymour Melman has wrote a very good book on this, the Columbia professor who studied how the military distorted and destroyed our economy following World War II. So it's a tragic, unnecessary, I would argue even a criminal act on the part of the Western alliance, because they knew precisely what they were doing, and it should, in a rational world, especially with Russia reaching out. Remember, especially after 9/11, Putin really, and he had, of course, dealt with the Chechens and others. He really wanted to build an alliance. I mean, in very good faith, and he was just rebuffed, and not only rebuffed but humiliated. And this is what we get.